Hi, everyone. Welcome to the third talk of Innovation in Linguistics by Cognitive Semantics. I'm Selena Liu. Today, we are very honored to have Professor Martin Hilpert with us. So good afternoon, Professor Hilpert. Before we get started, I'd like to invite the organizer of today's event, also the founding editor and editor-in-chief of Cognitive Semantics, Professor Fuyin Thomas Li, to introduce the event for us. Welcome.
Hi, good morning, Professor Martin Hilpert, and good evening, our audience. So before I introduce our speaker today, first I introduce my editorial team. The one who was speaking just now, Selena Liu, serves as the editorial assistant for Cognitive Semantics. And she is now visiting Singapore. And the second is Dr. Du, the second editorial assistant. And she's in Beijing. And Zhuo Shan now is in Leuven, Belgium. So the innovation organizative semantics only invite most distinguished scholars in the world. So we have invited Professor Chomsky last week. So our speaker today, Professor Martin Hilpert, definitely fit this capacity very well. So Professor Hilpert is among the very few scholars who did original contribution to grammar and related research. Professor Hilpert delivered a series of 10 lectures at our forum. And I don't know if you can see the book. So this is the book. This is the result of his 10 lectures. And it has become one of the best sellers in the series. Since this is not in classroom, I will provide an informal introduction. And this book will go to the audience who asks the best questions tonight. Professor Hilpert also serves as our associate editor and give us a lot of support. He can always recommend the best reviewers and make the best decision on the manuscript. And also he's the most favorite scholars, a nice supervisor, and a very pleasant person to work with. Now I think, Selena, you have more? Before we invite Professor Hilpert?
Yes, okay, thank you, Thomas. Now, please allow me to introduce Professor Martin Hilpert. Professor Martin Hilpert is Professor of English Linguistics at University of Neuchâtel. Professor Hilpert holds a PhD from Rice University and did postdoctoral research at the International Computer Science Institute in Berkeley and at the Freiburg Institute for Advanced Studies. So Professor Hilpert is interested in cognitive linguistics, language change, construction grammar, and corpus linguistics. Professor Hilpert is the author of Germanic Future Constructions and Constructional Change in English. And last year, Professor Hilpert and his two collaborators edited a book titled Modality and Diachronic Construction Grammar. So now the floor is yours. Thank you, Professor Hilpert.
Welcome, Professor Hilpert.
Thank you very much, Thomas. Thank you, Selena, for this nice introduction. I'm really glad to see you. I'm glad to be able to talk to you today. So Thomas mentioned that I was invited to Beijing to give lectures at the Cognitive Linguistics Forum. So many fond memories from that spent there, and it's really a great honor to be here today to be able to talk to you. So Thomas and Selena both mentioned that I'm interested in diachronic construction grammar. And that is true, of course, but I'm going to talk about it's going to be very, very different. That's maybe a good theme. I won't be talking about construction grammar or about language change. Rather, I'll be talking about a phenomenon that is going on in present day language, and it's related to constructional questions, but it also goes beyond that. So what I'll be talking about are short words in English. And this is work that I've been doing together with my two team members, David Correa Saavedra and Jennifer Rains, who have been working with me on this topic. And so what we're investigating is how speakers of English produce shortened versions of words, okay? So we can jump right in with a few examples of such words. You will all know them. I don't have a lot of explaining to do. So you all know words such as English prof or gator or fridge, which are shortened versions of longer words to which they correspond. Yeah, so for prof, that's professor. For gator, it's alligator. For fridge, it's refrigerator. And just by looking at the parts of these words, you see that clipping can work in very different ways. So in prof, there's the final part of the long word that is missing, so to speak. In fridge, it's a part in the middle that is kept, and then from the front and end, there are parts that are missing. And in alligator, in the middle, it's actually the first part of the word that is missing. So just from looking at these three examples here, you could get the idea that clipping is pretty unsystematic, pretty unconstrained, and it seems that anything goes. Yeah, and that has puzzled many people, and it also has puzzled me. So the question I want to ask in this talk is whether clipping is really so chaotic and unsystematic as it has sometimes made out to be, been made out to be. So I want to ask whether we can actually explain when and why speakers clip off different parts of a word. Can we explain that? Are there factors that allow us to make an educated guess about how a clipping will be formed, or is really everything purely accidental? Yeah. So ultimately, what we want to find out in this project is what goes on in speakers' minds when they create a short word on the basis of a long word. So I want to make this a little bit more concrete, and for that, I actually need your help. So on the next slides, you will see long words and then alternative short words. And your task is to select the short word that you like better. So you have to choose one of the short words choice. And it would be great if you could put your answers in the chat. So I'm opening the Zoom chat window, and yeah, you can just type in the variant that you like best. If you're ready, we can start. Here we have the first long word, navigator, someone on a ship who's responsible for navigation. And let's say you want to give that person a short nickname. Would it be, or would you prefer? Okay, I see some answers coming in here. And to me, it looks, well, we have a large majority for nav, but we also have navic. Yeah, so, okay, that's interesting. We'll keep that in mind, and we'll go straight to the next one, right? So here we have the word municipal. It's an adjective that means at the level of the city or the community. So it's an administrative term. There can be municipal services, for example, the people who take out the trash and so on and so forth. And I already see your responses coming in here. And as far as I can see, it's actually unanimous. You all like the two-syllable version better than the monosyllabic version. And that's kind of interesting because you could think, well, we could prefer the short one when there's a choice between a 1-syllable clipping and a 2-syllable clipping. We'll pick the short one. But here it seems that no, we really want the longer one. Yeah. I'll give you one more example. Renovation. So let's say that you have a little company that helps people renovate. Would you rather name it Reno or would you name it Renoff? Okay. Again, lots of, it's almost unanimous here, Reno. A few Renoffs. Okay. Thank you so much for your participation here. So in a nutshell, what I want to do in this talk is whether the results that we've collected here very anecdotally, whether they can be explained or predicted in any way. Yeah. So would it be possible for us to guess that, all right, so in this case, people will prefer Reno to Renoff when you give them the choice in a more controlled experimental setting. Okay, now my plan for the next minutes is the following. I'll start with a few general observations about clipping and how it works in English. I'll also talk about previous work. So what do we currently know about clipping? And then in the second part, I want to talk about our data that we've collected. David, Jennifer, and I have been putting together a database of English short words. We have more than 2,000 in our database. And we've annotated those clippings for different variables that we believe have an impact, are important. And we'll give you an overview of the different variables and the different elements that are found in the database. And then as we go to the third part of the talk, there I will show you how we analyzed the database. So we used a statistical technique that is called configural frequency analysis. I'll explain what that method does and what insights we can get from it. And once we are done with that, I will present some experimental findings. So there we'll do something very similar to what we've been doing just a second ago. So we designed an environment where the participants had to choose between alternative clippings of a source word, and we analyzed the responses that people gave. Right. In the end, there will be some conclusions and also some pointers for future work, because there are important elements that we still have ahead of us in the project. Okay, so without further ado, how does clipping work? And here I have to start with, the statement, or two statements rather, that seem to be rather pessimistic. So clipping has been recognized to be very, very, that there's a lot of variation going on. And this has led some researchers to conclude that there are no systematic patterns at all. This is what you see in these quotes here. So the first one says, much of a word will be clipped off in clipping, nor even which end of the word will be clipped off. And then recent quotes from deletion too much at this point. If I'm telling you that, well, our data contradict these statements. There is a lot of variation, but there are some very clear tendencies that come out once we look systematically at a lot of data, such as we have been doing now. Okay, so I can also point to some other work that has been, let's say, more, accepting of the idea that there is variation and we can probably analyze it. So there's important work that has been done by Sabine Arndt-Lappe. She has expressed this view in a recent paper where she calls for studies that try to build models that try to predict how words will be shortened. So she says a general problem in assessing the predictability of output structures of truncatory processes, that is shortening processes, is that in much of the pertinent literature, the degree of predictability is not in the focus of investigation. So people are saying, right, this is possible, that is not possible. They're not really saying, here, this solution would be a little bit better than that, or there would be a high chance that people clip this word in this way rather than another. So the work that I'm going to present to you today tries to go in this direction that has been outlined by Sabine Antlappe. Okay, I want to point to some other work that has been very inspiring to our team. So, for example, it has been investigated how speakers choose, let's say, end clipping rather than front clipping. And this has been analyzed empirically. One analysis that I single out here has been carried out by Thomas Berg. And he has analyzed a database of just shy of 1,000 clippings and shortened names. So Tom from Thomas, for example. Yeah. And he finds that there are a number of really robust tendencies. Clipping is really rare with names. Tom, if you have Jessica, you shorten it to Jess, and so on and so forth. There are interesting exceptions. So for example, if your name is Elizabeth and your friends call you Beth, then, well, that is a front clipping. Yeah? So that goes against the general tendency. He also finds that front clipping is more typical with source words that don't have their stress on the initial syllable. Yeah, and if you think about it, that really makes sense. Yeah, so in a language such as English, the word stress gives you important information about the word. Yeah, to recognize it as a hearer. And take away the first syllable of a word, that makes it very difficult to retrieve what word has been intended. And if that syllable is also stressed, that makes it even more important. So taking away the first syllable when it's stressed, that really gives the hearer a hard time, so speakers don't do it when they clip words. Then he also finds that front clipping becomes more and more unlikely the longer the source word gets. That's quite interesting too. And he finds that the tendencies are not quite the same. They don't play out in the exact same way for nouns and for names. Yeah, so it seems that names have their own grammar when it comes to shortening, and then ordinary nouns that refer to things in the world, they have a different pattern. Yeah, okay, so that is quite interesting, and I'll come back to these findings in when I'm discussing our own results. Now, in terms what exactly drives the process of shortening words, there are some guiding ideas that we follow in our research. So Sabine Antlappe, whom I've mentioned, she has formulated a hypothesis that we adopted for our own work. So she argues that clipping is driven by cognitive motivations, by pragmatic motivations, and by phonological motivations. So cognition, context, interaction, and sound, they each have their role to play. And a crucial element is what she refers to as recoverability. So the clipping, the short word, has to be recognizable as the short or longer short. That is really important. Well, the safe choice for the speaker, in the light of recoverability, would simply be to use the entire word and not shorten the word at all. Yeah. However, there's also a competing motivation, namely the principle of least effort. Speakers, as human beings, we are lazy and we want to do as little work as possible to get the job done. Yeah, so that's the principle of least effort, and recoverability and the principle of least effort, they pull in different directions and they balance each other out. That's another important insight. And then Sabine Antlappe notices a number of tendencies that characterize clippings and that sort of strike a balance between recoverability and the principle of least effort. For example, many clippings, they tend to keep the first syllable of the word because the first syllable is a really good cue for the longer word. There's also the tendency that the main stress of the word is retained. This holds at least for so-called stress-timed languages such as English. There are other languages, syllable-timed languages such as French, where stress works in a different way. Yeah, so I'll come back to all of this. But for now, let me just formulate the general questions that guide the work that I'm going to talk about. So first of all, does English clipping follow predictable tendencies? And you've already understood from what I've been saying so far that yes, there are tendencies that we can observe. Second question, can those tendencies be quantified? Can we capture them with a statistical probabilistic model? Yeah, so there we'll have some data, we'll have a statistical procedure, and we'll look at the results and see how well behaved the data really are. And then in a third question, in a third step, I want to ask, can the features of the model be explained functionally in terms of cognitive, pragmatic, and phonological motivations? All right, so with all of that in mind, I want to come to the data that we have. So David, Jennifer, and I have been compiling a large database of English clippings. And that process has been really a little bit special for me because normally I work with corpora and I am interested in syntactic constructions and how they change. And for that kind of work, it's relatively easy to retrieve the data if you have a search pattern and you retrieve relevant examples. You maybe make a choice. So you have to look at target construction or not. But generally, getting the data words. So that was, of course, we were lucky to find something like that because there are lots of clippings in there. Then you see that I put Qualtrics here. So we actually recruited speakers of English who filled out a questionnaire for us in which they gave us short words that they would use in their everyday conversations. All right, so we took all of that, but I'd like to point out that we looked at all of those entries very critically, and we didn't take everything. So we didn't include in our database, for example, shortened names. We didn't use acronyms or initialisms, so things like USA, for example. If it's just the letters, we didn't take that. We didn't include words that are at the same time shortened and then augmented with a suffix. So for example, for the English word husband, there's the word hubby, okay? So that means that husband is shortened, but at the same time, there's this little suffix at the end. So whenever there was additional material, we did not take it. And then we also didn't take words that really come from phrases. So absolutely, abfab, that means absolutely fabulous. Son of a, I let you figure out for yourself. Yeah. So those elements we did not take. I'm happy to talk about the reasons why we made these decisions. I just wanted to get you an idea of what is in the database and what is not in the database. All right. So with all that in mind, let's take a look at the way we annotated the data. So there were several factors that we thought mattered, and those factors we annotated in the database. So I'm going to show you a couple of graphs that show how the clippings can be grouped according to a number of different variables. So here you see the clippings grouped in terms of the number of syllables. And it's easy to see that most clippings are very short. So the number of clippings with one syllable is higher than the number of clippings with 2 syllables. Then we have 3-syllable clippings, and the rest, well, there's not much going on, but we do find such clippings as well. If I'm moving on to the different parts that are clipped off, so also there's a relatively clear tendency. Most clippings in our database are end clippings, like prof from professor. So the final part of the word is missing. And then we have a number of patterns that have different parts that are clipped off. So the next in line is the pattern for front clipping, where the initial part of the word is missing. Then we have some instances where the middle part of the word is missing, or some internal part of the word. And here you actually see that, okay, nuggets, well, it's actually the plural S that is maintained. So from nugget, it's nug. That would be normal end clipping, if you like, but the plural ending is still there. So that gives you nugs from nuggets. Quite interesting. Yeah, I'll come back to things like this. I'm just showing you these different distributions here. The next thing I want to talk about is the morphology of the clippings. So what we investigated was whether the remaining part of the clipped word is either a word, a morpheme, or something that is not even a morpheme. So, and that would be actually the most frequent category. So prof is not a morpheme, right? And so this is what we call submorphemic clippings. In sub, from subordinate, well, sub, that is a morpheme with the broad meaning, so under or less important or something of that sort. Yeah. And then in the clipping step, from stepsister, well, there the clipped word is actually a complete word in and of itself. Yeah. So that actually happens not that infrequently. So that's quite interesting too. Then I'm coming to issues of sound here, and previous research on clippings has yielded an important finding, namely that sound factors, either pertaining to the phonemes or pertaining to the arrangement of phonemes, they have a really large influence. And so we want to control for these factors. And with regard to the segments of the clippings, we divided our data into 3 categories that capture different endings. So we distinguish clippings that end in a consonant cluster, like merch from merchandise. We have clippings that end in a single consonant, such as prof. And then we have clippings that end in a vowel, such as demo. Yeah, and what you see is that the consonant clippings, they're really the most frequent ones. And if you add the cluster and the single consonant, well, you find that about 75–80% of the clippings actually end in at least one consonant. So that means that there's a strong preference for closed or even heavy syllables. And that actually makes sense in terms of recoverability. Yeah, so a closed syllable means that there is relatively, so a lot of material in a short amount of time. Yeah, so a closed syllable clipping is short, but still very recognizable. Yeah, so clippings that have this form, they can be very informative, but very short at the same time, and that's how people choose them. Moving on to stress. So we distinguished clippings that have initial stress, such as demo, from clippings that have their stress on a different syllable. So for example, in demob, the stress is on the second syllable. And it's easy to see that, well, this pattern, that's really an exception. Yeah. So most clippings have stress on the first syllable. But of course, most clippings just have one syllable, right? So there's no choice. The stress is necessarily on the first syllable. So what will be interesting is to check whether this distribution of initial and non-initial stress is really the same across clippings of different syllable lengths. Yeah, I will return to that in just a few minutes. Still on the topic of stress, we noted for each clipping in our database whether or not it would preserve the main stress of the source word. So as you can see, the chances are about 50-50. Yeah, this seems to be pretty random. So in admin, from administration, yeah, so the original stressed syllable is no longer there. Admin is stressed on the first syllable. Administration is stressed on the fourth syllable. Yeah, dinosaur and dino, no difference. Yeah, so it's both on the first in the long word and in the clipping. Okay, there are still a few things that I want to show you. And the next thing is parts of speech. Yeah? So previous studies of English clippings have noted a very strong bias that we find confirmed in our data, namely that most clippings are clippings of nouns. Yeah? Nouns are by far the most frequent lexical class in our data. You also find adjectives, verbs, interjections, and so on and so forth. Interestingly, there are quite a few that can be either a noun or an adjective, or either a noun or a verb. So technically you could add these to the noun category and make it even higher than it is. So mostly nouns, all the rest is relatively marginal. Then one final graph before we move on. This is a distinction that we've discussed quite a bit in the project, and the issue here is whether a source word is a simple lexical item or whether it is a compound. So exec from executive, so executive is the source word. That's not a compound, but high resolution, which gives us the clipping high res, that actually, well, there the source is a compound word. And as you can see, compounds actually account for quite a sizable chunk of the clippings. Right, so that gives you a good first impression of the elements that we have in our database. And I want to briefly recapitulate what I've been going over so far. So I've been presenting to you 8 variables that we have annotated in the database. Yeah. So number of syllables, the clipped part of the word, the morphological status, final sound, and so on and so forth. Yeah. And these variables, they allow us to characterize our clippings in very, very precise terms. Yeah. Actually, we've not just done annotations for these variables, but no, being the corpus linguists that we are, we actually included a number of corpus linguistic variables that I won't discuss in this talk, but that we still have for future analyses. So these are things that have to do with frequency, with neighborhood density, with dispersion, with things like that. So there's still a lot of data that we are in the process of exploring, but not for today. Right, I want to come to the things that we can learn from the data. So it's nice to have a database that is annotated for lots of variables, but what can we actually conclude on the basis of that data? So our approach here is that we adopt a statistical tool that is called configural frequency analysis. And in the next few minutes, I want to explain how this technique works and what results we can obtain if we use it. So essentially, the approach relies on a cross-tabulation of 2 or more variables. We can start with 2, yeah? And I want to take an example to make this more concrete. So one variable that I talked about is the length of clippings. So does a clipping have 1 syllable, 2 syllables, 3, or even more syllables? And then another variable that I mentioned is the retention of stress. Is the clipping stressed in the same way as its source word, or is there a difference? Now, if we put these 2 variables together, we can ask whether the length of a clipping influences whether or not it retains the stress of the word. So expressed differently, when we compare clippings that are 1, 2, 3, or 4 syllables long, is the rate of stress retention always the same? And in order to check that, we can feed the numbers of examples that we have in our database into a table like this. So here we have two variables that are cross-tabulated. This is the stress variable. Is the stress retained? Is it not retained? And here we have the one-syllable clippings, the two-syllable clippings, three syllables, and four or more syllables. You see there aren't many, but still, we have that data. Okay, the numbers in the cells tell you how many examples we have in our database for each configuration, for each cell in the table. And in the brackets behind the frequencies, you see the expected frequencies, which we can calculate. Yeah, so given that we have about 1,200 one-syllable clippings, and given that the distribution between stress retained and stress not retained is about 50-50, we would expect around 600 one-syllable clippings that have their stress retained and have their stress not retained. Yeah, so just by pure chance, we would end up with this 50-50 distribution. However, in the actual frequencies, you see that it's not the case. Yeah, there is an overrepresentation of one-syllable clippings that have their stress retained rather than not retained, and that is quite interesting. Yeah, so this cell of the table here is overrepresented, and the other one is underrepresented. Let me show you the overrepresented and underrepresented cells in this table. So everything that is marked up in red here is overrepresented. It happens more often than we would expect by chance. And what you can see is that there's a split, a split between one-syllable clippings and longer clippings. So that means one-syllable clippings really have a strong tendency to have their stress retained, and the longer clippings, they show the opposite tendency. Yeah, so the multisyllable clippings have a greater probability of changing their stress patterns, and this is not only interesting, it also corresponds to the tendency of clippings to facilitate recoverability. Yeah, you remember that I talked about this earlier. Short clippings have a greater need to retain their stress so that they can be identified, they can be recovered easily. And longer clippings, by contrast, well, they are easy enough to recognize even with the changed stress patterns. Yeah, so since they are longer, there's more material to give you the right cues. Right, so this cross-tabulation of two variables already gives us a first insight into how clippings work in our database, but there's actually more. So let me take another example of two variables that interact in this way. So the first variable is the type of clipping that we observe. So the difference between end clipping and front clipping, middle clipping, etc., etc. And the second variable is the morphological status of the clipping. So that could be a morpheme, a submorphemic unit, or even a word. If we put those two together, we can ask whether end clipping and front clipping yield clippings that differ in their morphological status. So is perhaps end clipping more likely to produce clippings that correspond to a morpheme rather than a submorphemic string? And in this slide, you see the cross-tabulation of the two variables. Again, it's the observed frequencies and then the expected frequencies. And if the observed frequencies are bigger than the expected frequencies, then you see then there's some overrepresentation, there's something going on. In this case, there are some interesting findings. Namely, if we look at end clippings first. So end clippings have a greater than chance tendency to be morphemic. Yeah. So for example, in English, there's a word paleo, which refers to paleo diet. Yeah. That means you eat lots of meat and not any rice, for example. Yeah. Terrible. I couldn't do it. So I'm not quite sure what that is, but what we can see is that there's an overrepresentation of morphemic units that are end clipped. If we go down one line to front clipping, here's really a big overrepresentation, so that clippings that are front clipped, well, what remains is an entire word. And this is often the case for compounds that are clipped. So that, for example, you have the word nightclub and the modifier night is being clipped off. So you're just going to the club instead of the nightclub. And again, this is in line with recoverability, since, well, the head of the compound, which comes at the end, well, it signifies the kind of thing that the compound refers to. So it makes sense to say club for nightclub. And then finally, I want to draw your attention to these middle and end clippings here. They almost exclusively yield submorphemic clippings. And one example for that is rom-com from romantic comedy. So rom is not a morpheme, com is not a morpheme. So there, the clipping really cuts into the morpheme boundaries and into a morpheme, and it doesn't respect morpheme boundaries. Okay. Now, before we go into the analysis proper, I just want to show you one more thing that illustrates why this kind of analysis matters. So we've seen how end clipping and front clipping differ with regard to morphology, but of course the same variable can also differ with regard to other factors that we've annotated. For example, with regard to sound. Yeah, so we can ask whether end clipping and front clipping yield clippings that differ in their final phonological segment. Yeah, so for example, we could hypothesize, is end clipping more likely to produce clippings that end in a vowel? Yeah, so by now you're familiar with the kind of table that you see here. And if we inspect the observed and expected frequencies, we see again a number of interesting tendencies. So middle clippings, if we start here, they commonly end in a consonant cluster. So clusters are hugely overrepresented. And this is due to clippings like shorts, stats from statistics, gents, and nugs from nuggets. I've given you the example earlier. So these are plural forms that are technically end clipped, but they retain the plural S. Then if we move up one line, front clippings, well, they have a higher than chance probability of ending in a consonant. So quake and shroom are examples of that. And this is in line with recoverability. If you take away the front of a clipping, well, that makes it hard to recover the source word. So the least you can do as a speaker is to make sure that there's a final consonant so that the hearer has a chance to identify the source word. And then finally, we have end clippings, which are overrepresented with final vowels. Yeah? So forms such as dino or limo, so dino from dinosaur, limo from limousine, they appear more often than expected. Okay, with all of that in mind, let me get to the configural frequency analysis and explain to you what it does, how it works. The input to the analysis is our entire clipping database, and here especially the annotations for 7 variables that I showed to you earlier. Yeah, so all of these variables, they are cross-tabulated with each other. So that goes beyond the bivariate tables that we've seen on the previous slides. So here the analysis creates an organization of the data that combines all 7 variables and their respective levels. I cannot visualize that on a 2-dimensional surface. Yeah, so that is what physicists would call a multi-dimensional space. And the goal of the configural frequency analysis is to use this table to find configurations of features that appear more often in the data than we would expect. So at the basis, it's really just a simple comparison of observed frequencies and expected frequencies. And in addition, there's some significance testing going on. So the configural frequency analysis uses the chi-square test of independence to test whether there's any asymmetry in the data that is statistically significant. And since the analysis performs many such tests for 2-dimensional tables, it uses what's called a Bonferroni correction in order to adjust the required probability of error downward. So the test only gives you a significant result if there are really, really clear tendencies in the data. Yeah, I'll be happy to say more about the technical details if you want me to. For now, I just want to make this more concrete. Namely, let's suppose that we have a clipping that has one syllable that is an instance of end clipping. It has a morphological status so that it's a submorphemic unit. It ends in a consonant. It has initial stress, and that stress is preserved from the source word, and the source word is not a compound. So an example for this kind of clipping would be the word croc from crocodile. Yeah, one syllable, stuff at the end is missing. It's submorphemic, ends in a consonant, has initial stress, and stress from croc and crocodile is the same, and the source word is not a compound. Right. The question for the configural frequency analysis would be, are forms such as croc overrepresented in the database, or do we see them less often than we would theoretically expect? And the answer to that question is that croc is vastly overrepresented. It is what the analysis calls a type. So a configuration that is found much more often than we would expect by chance. Yeah, so these features here appear in this configuration much more often than we would expect. We observe over 350 clippings like croc, yeah, but we would expect to find only about 140 by chance. So here the analysis tells us that this is a very significant asymmetry. And the overall output of the configural frequency analysis gives us a list of such types, yeah, configurations that are significantly overrepresented. And it also gives us a list of so-called antitypes. So those are configurations that we expect to see, but that are absent from the data, or at least not as strongly represented. Yeah? And if you allow, I would like to walk you through our results here by showing you 3 more types and then an antitype. So to start with the types, yeah, one of the most striking clipping types that we have discovered is exemplified by words such as poly or extra or hydro or mono. Yeah, and they have 2 syllables. They're end clipped. The morphological status is that they are morpheme. Often it's a classical morpheme from Greek or Latin. It ends in a vowel. It has initial stress. It does not retain the stress of the source word, and it does not derive from a compound. So we have more than 100 of these in our database, and we would actually expect less than 10, yeah, just by chance. So that means that there's really a strong tendency going on here. Here's another type that is exemplified by words such as delish or profesh. So delish from delicious, profesh from professional. 2 syllables, end clipping, a submorphemic structure, final consonant, quite often the sh, but there are also others. The stress is non-initial. Stress is preserved from the source word, and the source word is not a compound. We observe 31 examples of this kind. We would expect only 6. All right. I know I'm showing you lots and lots of data. Apologize for that, but I want to show you this other type here, which I find really fascinating. It's the rom-com type, so from romantic comedy. It has 2 syllables. It has this interesting middle and end clipping structure. It's submorphemic, ends in a consonant, preserves the stress, or no, does not preserve the stress. And this time, the source word is a compound. Yeah. Okay, so rom-com, that stands for romantic comedy, sitcom for situational comedy, sitrep is a situation report, mil-spec are military specifications, and so on and so forth. Yeah. So what you see here is that we observed 11 of these, but we expected only 1. So that means that the type isn't very frequent in absolute terms, but if you look at the expected frequency, you see a strong difference between what you would expect and what you actually observe. So configural frequency analysis can draw your attention to patterns that you may not have noticed if you just looked at the most frequent features, the most frequent patterns, but it actually lets you dig deeper into the data. Sorry, it just started to rain outside. So now let me show you one antitype, one configuration that we would expect to see, but which is relatively absent from our data. And that antitype is exemplified by clippings such as rehab, from rehabilitation. So they have two syllables, they're end clippings, they're submorphemic, the end in a consonant are initial stressed, so it's rehab. They don't preserve the stress from the source word, and the source word isn't a compound. You do find clippings of this kind in English. So besides rehab, there's intel from intelligence, admin from administration, improv from improvisation. And well, we do find them, but not as often as we would expect. Yeah, so we would expect to see them a lot more. Right. Now, earlier in this talk, I asked you to decide between two possible clippings, namely Reno and Renoff. If you still remember which one you picked, here we can sort of have a solution to the puzzle. So on the basis of our analysis, I can tell you that Renoff instantiates this rehab antitype, a configuration that appears less often than is expected. So if you decided that Renoff did not sound quite right, you have subconsciously reacted to this kind of statistical tendency. But what about Reno? Is Reno any better? Well, actually, yes. Yeah. So Reno is a lot like the hydro type that I discussed, except its morphological status is not morphemic, but rather it is submorphemic. So let me just show you that. So here we have the structural features of Reno. Here we have hydro. So the only difference is here in the morphological status. And for Reno, which has two syllables, it's an end clipping, it's submorphemic, ends in a vowel, is initial stressed, and doesn't preserve the stress and doesn't derive from a compound. We find this configuration about twice as often as expected. Yeah, so that makes it one of the significant types, and it's illustrated by words such as condo or docu or ammo for ammunition, deli for delicatessen, and indie for independent. Yeah, so all of those are well-known clippings, meaning that Reno really should have a boost in a forced choice task like the one that we did. Yeah, so if you nonetheless pick Renoff, you don't have to worry. There are clippings in English, such as, for example, improv from improvisation, and you may have used that to draw an analogy. Yeah. Anyway, the little experiment that we did, well, it's giving us interesting results, but nonetheless, it's important to do these kinds of tests under controlled conditions where you can really finely manipulate all the variables that enter into the analysis. And this is what I want to talk about in the final part of my talk here. Yeah, so our basic question was to see whether the results that we obtained from the analysis of the database could be confirmed under laboratory conditions. So when you let people choose between alternative clippings, are their choices in line with the findings that I've been presenting so far? Yeah, so here's where it gets interesting. So for the experiment, we used 4 types from the database, that is 4 groups of clippings that each have specific characteristics and that were overrepresented in the data. Yeah? And these 4 types are illustrated by the clippings that you see here. DEET for detail, SIMU for simultaneous, ANCHOVE for anchovy, and rom-com, well, you've seen that type from romantic comedy. Now, DEET from detail is a 1-syllable end clipping that is submorphemic. It has a final consonant. It has initial stress. It preserves the stress from the source word, and the source word is not a compound. Yeah. Then for SIMU, we have a different configuration. Yeah, it overlaps to some extent, but it's has 2 syllables, final vowel, and it doesn't preserve stress. And for anchovy, a different configuration. Yeah. And then we have rom-com, where the source word is actually a compound, it's clipped submorphenically, and so on and so forth. All right. So why did we choose these 4 configurations, these 4 types? There's a reason for that, namely that each of these types has what I like to call an evil twin. Yeah. So these clippings have correspondences, so to speak, yeah, where we have clippings with the exact same structural characteristics, except for the final segment. Okay. DEET has a final consonant, D has a final vowel, but all the other structural features are the same. Okay. SIMU has a final vowel, SIMUL has a final consonant, but all the rest stays the same. Yeah. So for anchove from anchove, it's the same difference, romco and romcom. So really all these forms, just the original clippings and the evil twins just differ in the final segment. Yeah. So what makes this interesting is that the evil twins in the database are significantly less prevalent. Yeah, so they are either antitypes, so they occur a lot less often than would be expected, or they occur just about with the frequency that would be expected by chance. So our prediction would be that when we give speakers the choice between DEET and D, yeah, that our participants would be less likely to choose the evil twin. That's the prediction. Yeah. So given a source word and 2 alternatives, which clipping would a speaker choose? Here I've underlined the predictions that we made based on our database analysis. So the types are underlined, the evil twins are shown in red. Right. We aimed to minimize the chances of including source words with existing clippings that speakers might know. Yeah. And so consequently, our selection contains many items that are infrequent. So for example, tucuma, that is a Brazilian fruit. And there are words such as scopiferous. I had to look that up. Yeah, so it's a word that means you have a tuft of brush-like hair. Yeah, well, it's a strange word. We used Webster's unabridged dictionary to identify source words with the relevant stress patterns. And for each source word, we created a consonant final clipping and a vowel final clipping. And in all cases, the 2 variants would have the same stress pattern, the same length in syllables. Yeah. So, for example, the word stupendous, that's a word meaning astonishing. For that, we would have stoop and we would have stew. For the word staphylotomy, we would have staffel and staffy. Yeah. You will notice when I say staffel and staffy, the final vowel is not exactly the same. Yeah, it's more of an I in staffel and it's more of an E in staffy. That is a difference that we had to allow in order for the experiment to work. Yeah. All right, so that's what I meant by schwa, deneutralization in the final vowel. So that is something that I'm happy to talk about if you have questions. We recruited participants via an online platform, prolific.co, and we got usable results from most of them. All participants lived in the United Kingdom or in the USA, and they considered English their first language. And they signed up voluntarily and they received some money for their time. And so on the next slide, you will see what a sample trial looked like. It's very much like what we did earlier. Spumescent, spoo, spoon. Okay, were you able to hear the sound? So it doesn't matter if you didn't hear it, yeah, but the first thing that people heard was my voice actually saying spumescent, and then spoo, and then spoom, Yeah, and then people would have the choice to play the words again, or they could select either the A variant or the B variant. There was no time limit to the experiment. It took people about 12 minutes to complete the entire thing. Okay, what did we find? The results show us that participants across the board preferred consonant final clippings across all of the 4 different pairs. Yeah, so here we have DEET and D, anshove and ansho, romcom and romco, simul and simu. In all 4, the dark bars are the final consonants. Yeah, so people really preferred that. And this is sort of halfway good news for us, because this lines up with our predictions for DEET, anshove, and romcom. It does not line up for simul and simu. Yeah. However, we note that here the tendency is actually the weakest. Yeah? When we compare that to the others, the gray bars are higher, the dark bars are higher than the lighter bars. Also, we note that regarding the monosyllabic clippings, so DEET versus D, there the preference is really the strongest. Yeah? With disyllabic clippings, it is relatively weaker. And so here I've shown you that this is contrary to our prediction, but the ratio of vowel final responses is at least the highest compared to the other 3. Then we used a binary logistic regression to analyze what factors impacted the choices of the participants. So we have several variables that I've boxed here in blue. These are the coefficients. So that a coefficient that has a positive sign tells you that there's a bias towards vowel final clippings. Yeah, so for example, clippings that end in I, there people preferred final vowels rather than final consonants. And if a coefficient has a negative sign, that means that there is a bias towards consonant final clippings. Yeah, so I'll talk about this in a bit more detail. The table shows effects in the expected direction for word length, for example. Yeah, this is the first line here. So when a clipping has 1 syllable, there is a significant effect that shows that speakers are biased towards final consonants. Yeah, so that was very reassuring. That is in line with the frequencies that we see in our database. When clippings are short, when they have just 1 syllable, then the likelihood of a final consonant goes up. Yeah. The second line here has to do with stress. So clippings that don't have initial stress, there also the likelihood of a final consonant goes up. And again, that is in line with recoverability, because, well, if the initial stress is, if the clipping does not maintain the initial stress of a source word, then the least you can do as a speaker is to include a final consonant. Yeah, I'm moving on to the third line here. This is the effect of compound status, and here we found something surprising. Yeah, so here for compounds we would have predicted that the final element is a consonant, but we actually see the opposite. We see a significant tendency indicating that speakers prefer final vowels. Yeah, and that puzzled us a little bit. So we went into the data and checked, why is it that we have this result? What forms are responsible for it? And well, the data indicate that this result is due to clippings that end in the sound I. Yeah. So there are, for example, clippings like Euc-Jai from Euclidean gyroscope, or Malstai from malleable styrofoam. You see, the words, the stimuli that we used, they are really, really contrived. Yeah, so those are not words that you encounter every day. Just we wanted to have stimuli that we could be pretty sure about, that speakers would never have heard this before. Yeah. Okay. There's one more thing that I want to talk about here, namely the effect of different final vowels in the clippings. So the analysis reveals asymmetries between the different vocalic elements that appear in the clipping stimuli. So for example, the vowel eh shows a bias towards final consonants. It's not quite significant, but it's there. Then the diphthongs I, ow, and a, they actually show an effect in the opposite direction. Yeah? So they introduce a bias towards vowel final clippings. And this can actually be interpreted because single vowels, they are likely to differ in pronunciation across word final and pre-consonantal environments. So you remember the example of staffel and staffy, yeah, or simu and simul. There, the vowel is a little bit different. And it could be that speakers are trying to avoid that, yeah, so that the vowel is not exactly the same as in the source word. But with I, ow, and a, so there we have the exact same sound in the clipping as in the source word. So given a source word such as, for example, tylosis, yeah, there the diphthong would be I, and in the clippings tile and tie, it is near identical, yeah, and that might explain why people are making the choices that they have made here. So just to wrap up, yeah, we can say that the results confirm that clipping as a word formation process is sensitive to various factors that have been proposed in the literature. So for example, word length or the position of stress or the final vocalic element, yeah. And if I go through the results that we found, we confirmed that monosyllabic clippings prefer final consonants. We confirmed that clippings with stress on a second syllable prefer a final consonant. So these two are in line with recoverability and with earlier results. Against our prediction, we found that compound source words prefer clippings with a final consonant rather than a final. Sorry, the other way around. Participants preferred vowel endings rather than final consonants. And new finding here is that different vowel endings contribute in different ways to the speaker's selection of either consonant final or vowel final clippings. Okay, I want to conclude here. I hope to have illustrated that clippings in English are not as chaotic and unprincipled as they have sometimes been described. If we look at a large collection of authentic clippings, we can actually see a number of broad tendencies. Some of them corroborate and confirm earlier results. So the noun bias, for example, that is in line with earlier research, the predominance of end clippings, the fact that front clippings and end clippings exhibit different characteristics with regard to their sound and with regard to their morphology. And our results are also in line with the general idea that clippings are optimized for recoverability. And then there are a couple of new insights, namely that clippings from compounds differ in their structure from clippings that don't derive from compounds, but from other words. Yeah? And then clippings of different lengths, they differ in their sound and morphological characteristics. And on a more general level, and here I'm coming back a little bit to construction grammar. There's not one single clipping schema. There's not one single rule that would account for how people are doing it, but rather there are different statistically significant types, like the croc type or the hydro type or the delish type, and so on and so forth. And if you have been thinking to yourself, okay, those patterns, could they be constructions in the sense of construction grammar? I would definitely say yes, that would be my interpretation. And describing clippings as a construction family is actually something that is on our to-do list for what we're still planning to do with this project. Okay, on that topic, here's our to-do list. We still need to analyze the quantitative corpus-based variables with regard to frequency and dispersion of clippings. We want to explore the meaning of clippings a little bit more. So I haven't talked at all about meanings. There are different ideas that I'd be happy to discuss if there are questions. We want to model clipping patterns as a network of constructions. And we also want to branch out to other languages. So we have been working on a database of French clippings, and there we will soon start analyzing the data in the way that we have already for the English data. So a lot more that still needs to be done. And I'd be more than happy to come back to you and talk about all of that at some later point in time. But for now, I really want to thank you for your time and your attention. And I also want to once again express my gratitude to Thomas and the organizers of the series for making this happen. It's been great seeing you, talking to you. Thank you very much. And if you have questions, I'll be more than happy to discuss them with you. I also cannot finish here without thanking David and Jennifer, my two team members. And with that, I'm looking forward to your comments and questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Hilpert, for your very enlightening talk. The update I think you presented in this talk today is as impressive as your 2021's paper. With this research, we now have a very comprehensive view of English clippings. So now we turn to the Q&A session. Actually, I have a question in my mind concerning the variables or predictors in multivariate analysis.
Yes.
Found that in my own research, it is quite difficult for me to determine which variables I choose to predict, I choose to probe into in my research, because sometimes we need to make sure the list is exhaustive, but at other times, for some variables, because there are disputes or there are different views on whether it is predictable or not. So may I ask how you and your colleagues choose the variables, and at the same time, and you may need to justify that other potential variables can be not included in the present research. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for that question. That's very relevant, of course. So in this project, we were actually lucky in that we could draw on previous work that had identified a number of variables that had been suggested as relevant. So we could just take that and collect it and see how all of those variables would, well, interact, or if, let's say, the effect of one variable would, would maybe outscale the effect of a different one. So we did not have the particular problem of having to justify using those variables. Yeah, but at the same time, we also included a number of variables that had not been considered in earlier research, and there, of course, we did provide motivations arguing why we thought this should be included. So, for example, the frequency-related variables that I haven't really talked about a lot today, I just mentioned them. So those haven't been thoroughly considered in earlier work, but for those we came up with our motivations why we thought it would be interesting, for example, to include frequency as a factor, because, well, there are known frequency effects, for example, with regard to processability and strengths of representation in memory. And those frequency effects, of course, relate to the big topic of recoverability that we that I've been coming back to throughout the talk. Yeah. So generally, well, when you have a research project and you are wrestling with the question, so which factors should I include? Is it justified to include this or that? The good news, I think, is that, that there is no right or wrong in the sense that someone could exclude from the start that no, that's just a bad idea to include that. You have the freedom or the ability to play around with that and to check for yourself if something makes sense. And sometimes this may just be a hunch or a feeling that you have that, you know, I think I need to include that, and the results might show you that, yeah, that there is actually an effect.
Yes, indeed, the frequency plays a very important role, especially when we adopt the usage-based approach to this phenomenon. Thank you. Thank you for your clarification. So now let's check if we have other questions from our participants. I noticed that Professor Shaobing, right?
Yeah.
Hi.
Hi.
Turn on your camera, yeah.
Hi. Yes. Hi, Martin.
Hi.
Yeah. I'm Bin Shao from Zhejiang University. Do you remember?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. So thank you for your interesting lecture. And I have a question. That is, well, when you in the types of clippings, and one type you mentioned is called rom-com, right? So something like a sitcom, right? Okay.
Yes. Yeah.
So here, I wonder if you have distinguishing between blends and clippings, because usually we think, well, rom-com is a kind of blending. So there is a danger that, well, it seems that you may include all the blends into clippings. So how to solve this problem? Yeah.
You're right to point out that there is a fine line to be drawn somewhere between clippings and blendings. So we did not include classic blendings like brunch or motel in our database. Yeah. Yeah, so and the reason, well, the way we distinguish between them, because it's not trivial, right? So we included cases like romantic comedy, where romantic comedy exists as a conventionalized unit, as a word. Yeah. So for a blend like brunch, there is no conventionalized element breakfast lunch. Yeah, so we're going to breakfast lunch. That doesn't exist. It's only brunch that exists. But for rom-com or for sitcom, those conventionalized combinations actually exist. So that's the test that we applied. When we had something that could be analyzed as a blend or as a clipping, we asked, can we say something like breakfast, lunch, and use that as a single word? And if the answer was no, then we decided, okay, we cannot include it in the clipping database.
Okay, so here it seems that you consider the semantic factors. So well, romantic comedy is like a linguistic unit, while for breakfast and lunch, well, it is not a unit, right?
Right. That's the principle. Yes.
Okay, but for us, we usually think, well, clipping is just a process of reduction, and for blends is it's the first reduction and then a combination. So two processes put together. So well, yeah, probably rom-com is a case in between, something like that, probably.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
I agree.
Okay. Thank you.
And I think it's very important to realize that the boundaries between these processes can be very, very tricky once you get into the detail. Yeah. So a lot of the factors that are crucial for blending actually show up in similar form as constraints on clipping. So you're probably familiar with work that Stefan Gries has done on blending. So in clipping, we're interested in, okay, what do people clip off, yeah, and what part remains? And in blending, the question is very similar, right? So what part of the first word do people have, and what's the part of the second word, and how are they put together? So ultimately, the questions are very related. The processes that are going on are related, and the factors that explain why speakers do either one thing or the other are also boiling down to the same underlying issues. So thanks a lot for bringing this up. The connection to blending, so that would be a talk in and of itself, right? So to explain how blending and clipping are different and how they are similar. So that's actually a great idea that I'll keep in the back of my mind for a future occasion.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, Marty. I have several questions. The first one is, I didn't quite understand your example of paramedic. Why do you call it a clipped form? Is it a clipped form of paramedical or paramedical doctor or what?
Yeah, I think paramedical assistant or paramedical doctor. Yeah, that I would have to look up in the database what the actual source word is, but one of those.
So medic is short for medical. So that is why you call it a clipping.
Yeah.
Okay. So para has nothing to do with parachute, right?
So a paramedic is someone is someone who well is not quite a doctor, but who is taking care of patients in emergency situations, right? Something of that sort. So so that the para is well, the kind of morpheme that says associated with that type of meaning, right? And I don't know if that's the same para in parachute, but I think it is. I could be wrong, but I don't actually know the etymology of parachute that well.
Okay. Okay. My second question is, for example, of Elizabeth, I think apart from Beth, Liz can also be the shortened form.
Absolutely.
So in your database, so in your database, are there any other such words which have two or more possible clipped forms for one and the same word?
Oh yes, absolutely, absolutely. So we have several clippings that derive from the same source word, but so for example, the word detective. I think we have three clippings for detective, namely deet, and tech, and there could be a fourth one. So that is very much a possibility. And there's also the inverse case. So we have lots of clippings that look the same, but have several different source words that are clipped with the same results. So for example, sub relates to more than 10 different source words. So it can be subordinate, it can be submarine, it can be substitute, sub-officer, and so on and so forth. So yeah, there are these many to one and one to many mappings that we have in the database.
But all these variants are belong to the same type, either front clipping or back clipping. But for the example of Liz and Beth, I think they belong to different types.
True.
One is back clipping. I'm wondering, are there any other such words which is similar to Elizabeth? Liz, Beth,
so I so coming back to detective, I think I'm not 100% sure, but I think tech might also be another clipping that would instantiate what you're saying, that there's one variant that is, let's say, end clipping, and another one that is either front and end or something different altogether. That is definitely possible. By the way, the database that we used is available. We're happy to share it. And you can get it either from the Glossa website where the paper is published, or you can write me an email and I'll be happy to share the data that we use. And there you can look up all the forms that informed our analysis.
My next question is for the both front and back clipping, such as fridge and flu. Are there any other English words which belong to this type?
So
it's very uncommon. Only encounter these two.
they're really rare, yeah. But so, for example, from the name Patricia, the nickname Trish is working in the same way. Yeah. So from Patricia, if you have just Trish, it's the pa that is missing and the final a that is missing. Yeah, but other again,
only the names. Okay.
That's the name. True. Yeah. So I would have to look that up really quick to tell you what other forms exactly conform to that pattern. And it's very rare.
Okay. Why the fridge, the spelling is changed? And why not F-R-I-G-E? Is it because we want to retain the original pronunciation? We don't want to pronounce it as frig, so we add D in the middle. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I think there the answer is analogy. So if you look at words such as bridge, there the D is there, and that is what biases speakers towards including the D. But orthography in English is really, really difficult. Yeah, so if you're looking for logic and systematicity in English orthography, then that it is going to be very, very difficult to have a principled explanation for these things. Most of it is really coincidental.
Okay. I have one last question for the word email. Email. Yeah. I'm wondering, how do you categorize it? Is it a back clipping or what? I think it's very hard to categorize.
Sure.
Which time do you think we lost to?
So my initial reaction would be that it's so the E is from electronic,
yes,
and mail is just mail. So I would say that's a case of middle clipping.
A middle clipping. Okay.
So that's
just like fridge and flu, right? Middle clipping.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. This is to retain the middle part. The fridge and for fridge and flu, and for email is to remove the middle part.
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you for your answer. I have no further questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Jay.
Thank you, Dr. Meng Qinglan, and thank you, Professor Hilpert, for answering those questions. And I noticed that in our another venue, that is Tencent meeting room, because we live stream your talk in Tencent software, and there is a question from a participant, but I think this is a follow-up question of mine, because the participant asked how you determined the analytical variables and the expected frequencies. Do you want to add something on that, or we just skip to the next one?
I can just maybe say a few words. So so for the variables, essentially we went through the existing literature and tried to identify variables that seemed really important to us, and then looking at the data. So during the process of data collection, there were also certain factors that just jumped out at us that prompted us to say, look, here's something that that is promising, that might give us an interesting result. And so that's how we included those variables. Now the expected frequencies, whenever you have a cross table, you calculate the expected frequency on the basis of the so-called marginal frequency. So if, for example, you have a cross table where one variable is the length of the word, like is it one syllable or is it two syllables? And then the other variable is, let's say, front clipping and end clipping. Then you have the overall number of one syllable clippings and the overall number of two syllable clippings, and you have the overall number of front clippings and end clippings. And on the basis of those so-called marginal frequencies, you can actually tell how many one syllable front clippings, how many two syllable front clippings or end clippings you would expect by chance. Yeah. So if the overall distribution of front clippings and end clippings would be 50-50, then you would expect the same amount of one syllable clippings and two syllable clippings across those two types. And well, as I've shown you, most often than not, these distributions that you would expect by chance, they don't actually show up in the data. There's always some asymmetry, some deviation from the chance distribution that you can observe.
Yes, some skewed distribution. Thank you for your clarification and supplements. And here we have two quick questions from Dr. Chen Lang. I think he's also from Nanyang Technological University. And he asks, are there any combinations of variables that never occur in your data, and what's their characters compared to those that are instantiated?
Yeah, so there are actually lots of combinations that do not occur at all. Many of them would not even be expected to occur all that often, because they are combinations of features that in themselves are really, really rare. Yeah. So for example, if you think about the example that Jack brought up just a minute ago, fridge, yeah, where apart from the beginning is missing, apart from the end is missing, and there's just something in the middle that is remaining. We don't have many examples of that in the database. And so if we cross-tabulate that feature with other variables, like for example, is the stress retained or not, then the expected frequencies are going to be very, very low. And more often than not, well, we simply don't have examples of this front and back clipping that instantiate all these other variables and their features that that we have entered into the analysis. So in those cases, the absence of a configuration may not be so telling, you know, and not so important, but that there are lots of configurations that really should appear a lot more often than they do. Yeah. So, and this is one example that I discussed, the case of Ronald from renovation. Well, it appears a lot less often than we would expect, given the variables and their levels and the frequencies of those levels. Yeah. Oh, and just to add one very general point. So the configurations that are absent, what they tend to have in common is that they are bad for recoverability. Yeah. So they would violate the principles of economy and the principle of least effort and all of these principles that make for very practical clippings. Yeah. So if you're interested in that, there's actually a longer discussion of exactly this question at the end of the paper that was posted in the chat. Yeah. So it's open access. You can download it for free. By the way, also the book on diachronic construction grammar, it's open access. You can just go to the website and download the PDF. It's still nice to have the paper copy, but well, just to get the information, you can just download it and have the PDF.
Okay, thank you for answering this question. And I think we have a participant.
Yes.
Sorry, Shan. You can also ask question if you like to.
Okay, thank you, Selena. Thank you, Martin. I have 3 questions. The first one is rather general. It seems a trend for linguistic studies to have a combined methods, namely the corpus-based methods and maybe combined with those experimental methods or even some computational modeling. So
yes.
In your study, why after the use of the corpus-based method and then you conduct a forced choice task? Because in my understanding, the data we collected from the corpus should be relatively representative and enough. And you also made some annotations. So what is the significance after the corpus-based that you do the forced choice task? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. This is a very relevant question. And of course, you're completely right that there is a tendency towards combining data from different sources, corpora, experiments. So in our case, the clipping database, it's actually a very strange source of data if you think about it. Yeah, so we have collected data from different dictionaries and from the internet, and we've asked people to give us examples. So whereas in a corpus, I would argue you can be pretty sure that you have an approximation of what speakers experience linguistically. So in our database, I would say that our argument for saying that, yeah, this is ordinary language use and this is how people experience clippings is that's not quite as strong a claim, because there are lots of clippings in our database that people will have never heard of. There are lots of types that are really strange and that are only known to a handful of specialized people. So in a way, we were not so trustful with regard to the data that we find. So we were really worried. Do our findings from the database translate to what normal people actually decide in their ordinary language use? Yeah, and so for our purposes, we considered it really important to have this additional piece of evidence to show that, yeah, the types that we do have in our database, any conclusion that we draw from them lines up reasonably well with findings that we have collected in an experiment. Yeah. Computational, you mentioned computational modeling. So that would be a great thing to do in the future. So if there's a continuation of the clipping project at some point, I think I would be tempted to try and do some agent-based modeling to see how clippings emerge in a community and how they conventionalize and how things like that happen. So that would be a great thing to do that, yeah, I would find very interesting.
Okay, thank you for your explanation. And my second question is, I noticed that in your study, the frequency of the clipped words are taken into consideration. But why instead of both the source word, the frequency of the source words and the clipped words taken into consideration? Because this reminds me of the grammaticalization or diachronic or the constructional change, and when a word is occurred relatively frequently, and it tends to get grammaticalized, and with its it will be phonologically and morphologically become reduced. So why the frequency of the source words didn't take into consideration? Thank you.
Oh, we have those two. We have those two. Yeah. No, we have a lot of frequency variables that so I can tell you one thing. So we have tried to see whether there were any frequency effects on the choice between front clipping and end clipping. Yeah, because we thought more frequent source words, they are more strongly represented in speakers' minds, so it should be easier to front clip frequent words than infrequent words. And so our analysis didn't really show a frequency effect of that kind. Yeah, but I totally agree that, yeah, the frequency of source words, of the long words, it's very important to keep track of them and just check whether they have any kind of effect that we might see in the data. So just there with regard to front clipping and end clipping, our predictions weren't confirmed, but who knows, there might be other effects that are really important.
Okay, thank you. And my third question is that maybe I got lost somewhere, but I suppose the method of HCFA couldn't tell us which predictor or which factor are more decisive than others. When we found that so many factors are really would contribute to the result of this clipped word. So which comes first, or which are more important?
Yeah,
thank you.
So you're right that the HCFA doesn't tell you that directly, but you can nonetheless see it in the results if you look at, let's say, types with only a limited number of factors. So which are the variables that show up, let's say, in the types that only have one or two different factors in them. Yeah, so the HCFA just mechanically goes through all possible configurations and then tells you for each variable and each factor, is there some kind of asymmetry? And so that means that you get lots and lots of results where the HCFA comes back and says, here I found a significant difference, but in and of themselves, those differences, well, you knew that they were there. So for example, we get super significant effects for length because one syllable clippings, they're much more frequent than two syllable clippings and so on and so forth. We get highly significant effects for part of speech because nouns are so much more frequent than other word types. And so by themselves, that doesn't tell you all that much. Yeah. But what we were really interested in is this interplay between the variables. So the HCFA, well, that's really where it shines, where it allows you to find out interesting things. And then in order to determine which factors are more important than others, I'd probably turn to some kind of regression modeling to see if there are factors that you can just safely ignore, or if there are factors that show you more or less the same thing. But again, it's a very relevant and very good question.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for your clear explanations. I think I got your point. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Thank you, Shan, and thank you, Professor Hilpert. Following Shan's questions, I have a question about your follow-up study, because in your 2021 article, in the conclusion part, you see you and your colleagues will investigate clippings from a cross-linguistic perspective, like the clippings between English and French. So I have the question of whether in your further studies you will take English varieties as a predictor or a factor.
Oh, Oh, yeah. Great suggestion. Great suggestion. So, yeah, that's actually something that I've been thinking about, whether there are differences in the way, clippings play out across different varieties of English. It is, it's known sort of that some word formation processes differ across varieties of English. So, for example, a famous example would be that in Australia you have all these clipped words with that are suffixed with an e. Yeah, so Barbie for barbecue and brekkie for breakfast and so on and so forth. So that is a really emblematic pattern for Australian English. And so it would not at all surprise me if there were variety-specific tendencies in clipping, also in the way that we've analyzed, so with just shortening and no augmentation. However, what I would think is that the overall cognitive factors that relate to recoverability and the principle of least effort, that they actually shine through across varieties, because those are general cognitive factors. I don't think there's any reason to think that they would behave in very different ways. Maybe the strength of the effect will be different. Yeah, maybe the interplay of some factors will be a little different, but the general direction of these factors, they should be reasonably similar. And so the interest of analyzing the different varieties would be, just to see if there are any differences of that kind, and if there's anything that's special, let's say, about Australian English or Nigerian English or English in the Philippines or other places where English is spoken, or even learner Englishes and traditional what are called inner circle varieties. Yeah. So, but again, great question. It's I'm making a little list here with new project ideas. It's getting longer and longer.
Thank you. Because in Singapore, I noticed that some scholars in my university and in National University of Singapore, especially some scholars in linguistics, they tend to compare Singaporean English with other English varieties in some linguistic phenomena. So thank you for your clarification. And may I invite
Martin, I just pop up another question. I think you just mentioned the urban dictionary, right? But I think that is not very academic, because everyone can add new word entries. So,
absolutely, yeah.
Yes, so if you include that kind of data in your research, I think it may be problematic to me.
So, obviously, we had to be very, very careful with regard to the data that we included in the database. And for each entry in our database, we noted the source where it came from. So if somebody would like to use our data, but they would rather not include data from the Urban Dictionary website, then it's really just one click and they can exclude those data points. So the reason we included them, so our criterion, so to speak, was that we wanted to have data that we consider to be authentic. And so for the Urban Dictionary examples, we considered, is this found in other contexts? So we would try and find specific clippings from the Urban Dictionary on other websites, yeah, if people actually use it. And if it turned out that people did, that we find a specific formation in other contexts, then we would go ahead and say, yeah, okay, this is fine. This is something that we can include. But we really, we excluded lots and lots of clippings where we thought, no, this is just too, this is just too obscure, or we don't believe that anybody is really using this in real life. And not just from the Urban Dictionary, also from the other sources. We were pretty critical, and we were also ready to reject material from the database when we thought, it doesn't really strike us as something that appears in the wild.
And I just tried to look up some of the words you mentioned in a dictionary, and I can't find them. So this is not a problem, right? As long as we can find such words on the internet, that can prove that people are.
Yeah. So in fact, most clippings in the database would not be expected to show up in any dictionary whatsoever. Yeah. So the clippings are most of them are, I would say, flying under the radar of lexicography. And many of them are also so community specific, So just to give you an example, so I've 3 children. The oldest one is a daughter, and the 2 younger ones are boys. And the boys, they enjoy video games a lot, and they use terms when they play with other with friends that are, many of them are clippings about the things that they have in the game. So I don't know, the scores or particular tools that they're using, or some kind of mode in which they're playing, and so on and so forth. And of course, those words, they've only existed for a very short time, and they only mean something in that context of the video game. And so I don't think they will ever be recorded in any dictionary whatsoever. And nonetheless, they, I would hypothesize that they conform to these tendencies that I've been talking about. So in a way, the interesting thing is not the clip forms in themselves, but rather what goes on when speakers form a clipping. What are the general, cognitive factors that lead to the formation of a clipping? And I think you can get at those questions even with clippings that finally don't last in the language, or don't make it beyond a very limited community.
Okay, thank you so much. And I'm not for the book, by the way, Thomas. I'm only for my questions. Thank you.
So you are doing against the rules. You asked too many questions.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Meng. You increase your probability of winning the 2 books. Okay, so Thomas.
It's for you.
Yeah. May I invite Li Zifan to ask a question? Hi, Zifan.
Hi, Tom. Hi, Prof. Hilpert. Can you hear me clearly?
I can hear you, yes.
As my major is French, so as you have also mentioned, you gotta branch out to other languages, so it interests me a lot. And what I'm mostly interested is in the sensibility of clipping towards the word class that is noun. And I'd like to clarify my question into 3 aspects. The first thing is about the numbers of noun clippings. As I have as you have already put it clearly in your findings, that clippings are chiefly nouns. And I have also searched in vain in my mind to find any other like verb clippings or adjective clippings in English. But I recalled that in French, we have sympa pour le mot sympathique. Well, that is an adjective.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. it is about the numbers. And the second aspect is about the productibility of those clipped words, as what we can derive from those clippings are mostly nouns as well. As for bike, we have biker. As for cob, we have cobber. But we don't have those derivations like verbs or adjectives as well. And the third thing is about our recoverability are mostly based on the nouns. For example, if we take renove as a stem word, like what we can recover from these clipping is renovation instead of renovate, as though they are actually family words. They look so similar to each other. And what made me so surprised is that in French, I'd like to bring up this word, le petit déjeuner. And si on dit, je veux prendre le petit déj, je veux prendre le petit déj, that is, we clip this noun into a shorter noun form.
Yeah.
But actually, le petit déjeuner peut aussi être utilisé comme a verb, right? So in this term, but in this aspect, we would not like say, on va petit déj. It would be quite ridiculous if we say so.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, so all of this interests me a lot. Like, how can we explain this kind of sensibility of clippings to nouns instead of other words classes? Thank you.
Yeah, great questions. Great questions. So with regard to adjectives, in English, for example, there was one type that I mentioned where you have delish from delicious and profesh from professional and so on and so forth. There's also perf from perfect, and you do find those. But I agree that so when I try to compare English and French in my mind, the French adjectives, there are more that are coming to my mind. So sympa, you mentioned sympa. Je suis dispo aujourd'hui. From disponible. And lots of others. So that would be an interesting question to investigate. Is there really a difference between English and French, and if so, what motivates that that difference? With regard to your question, why is there this noun bias, and for example, as opposed to verbs? I guess one factor that is important is that verbs, at least in English and French, they tend to be inflected, right? So you have pieces of morphology at the end of it. And so meaning that if you want to cut a piece of the verb, you have to decide, okay, so where do I cut so that the suffix fits with the clipping, and that might make it more complicated to just do it, and so people renounce to it and just use the verb as such. But again, that's just a hypothesis that I come up with here on the fly. But very interesting questions. Thank you a lot. I think I forgot one that you asked in the middle.
Oh, it's about the predictability of those clipped words.
Right, right. The predictability.
We can derive some other nouns from those clippings.
Yeah. So now, when you hear a word such as renov in isolation, then of course you can ask yourself, okay, does that stand for renovation or does it stand for renovate? And I guess there people's intuitions would be influenced by word frequency, so that you rather guess the frequent element rather than the infrequent element. But of course, in connected speech, you have lots and lots of cues as to what part of speech would the clipping be. So, for example, in the French example, ah oui, je suis dispo. there, well, you know that it's a predicative construction, and therefore dispo has to be an adjective rather than clipped from a noun such as disposition or what have you.
Same thing as medicine, medicine. So it is like more deduction according to the how do you say, particular context, right?
Right. The context gives away a lot, or gives you important cues for the recovery of the source word.
Yeah, I understand. Thank you for your explanation and your answer. Thank you.
Thank you for your question.
Yeah, I have a question. Yeah, I have a question, Thomas.
Well, okay.
I'm sorry.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm quite. Thank you. First of all, thank you very much for the wonderful speech. I'm really I'm interested in a question that is there any relationship between the words, the particular part of speech with the how can I say the words with vowels, for example, I give example that automobile, the clipping of automobile is auto, or professor, the clipping of the words is pro, and zoology, zoological garden, the clipping of it is zoo. So maybe is there any difference? I mean, for such words, they are nouns, professors or pro, and auto or zoo. Such words are nouns, and they are categorized with they are ending with vowels o. So I mean, in your data, do you find, is there any relationship between the particular part of speech with the such vowels? Yeah.
Okay, that's an interesting question. So that's something that we haven't tested systematically. If, for example, let's say clippings ending in O have a higher than expected chance of instantiating a particular type of speech. Yeah, but I wouldn't exclude the possibility. I think it's probable that there are such tendencies, and that, yeah, for example, let's say a final E. Yeah, when we can make a clipping that has a final E in it, well, a final E is, in other contexts, it can, yeah, it can, for example, signify that so many adjectives, for example, end in an E. Yeah, so friendly and happy and ready and so on and so forth. So it could be that speakers are subconsciously reacting to that, and then if the opportunity presents itself to clip an adjective so that it ends in an E, they would go for that. Yeah, so that would make sense. And it wouldn't surprise me if people do, but as I said, we haven't tested that. But it's easy enough to do. So in our data, the final vowel is annotated and the part of speech is annotated. So it's a matter of 30 seconds to, construct a little cross table and see if there's some interesting asymmetry going on.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, okay, Thomas.
Okay. Thank you, Jingmei, and thank all the participants who proposed questions. And thank you, Martin, for answering these very good questions. And I guess now you need to make a hard choice. That is, you need to choose from the questions, because Thomas wants to send the one who proposed, I think, the double quotation, the best question. The person who has the best question will own 2 volumes. One is your 2021 10 lectures book, and the other is the latest issue of Cognitive Semantics. Sorry for letting you doing this hard choice.
Okay. So I can name 2 people or just one person?
Up to you. I have one more book.
Okay, if I can, it's a terribly hard choice. Okay, but if I can choose, then I will. With apologies to all the others who've asked really excellent questions, of course. I select Sujan, question 5, and I select question 6, Lizzie Fan.
Okay.
Okay, thank you very much. So I keep them for them to return to the university. So
Yeah. Thank you very much, Professor Hilpert, for this wonderful talk. And we also thank,
Thanks for having me.
we also thank each participant for joining us. And we look forward to the next talk. And also we look forward to meeting you in related topics. Thank you so much, Professor Hilpert.
Thank you. It was really a pleasure to be with you today.
Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you. So
Bye-bye.
have a great afternoon.
you.
Yeah. Have a great evening, you all. Bye-bye.
Bye.